Jake Paul and UFC President Dana White haven't exchanged blows yet, but they are engaged in a fierce brawl, and their fight is happening in the most packed arena of them all, social media. In fact, Jake Paul has promised to keep up his relentless attacks on the UFC figurehead. So, stay tuned and don't go away, because today we're looking at why Jake Paul and Dana White keep going back and forth, and what will it achieve. First up, what caused this sudden kerfuffle? Let's take a look. YouTube sensation Jake Paul and UFC boss Dana White have been going back and forth in what appears to be a brutal, no-holds-barred war of words over the last few days. Why? The reason is simple. Paul, an unbeaten boxer, is demanding that fighters be paid better and has openly accused White of essentially shortchanging and ripping off his fighters. As a result, Paul will continue his attacks on White over the issue. And no matter what you may or may not think of Paul, his efforts here do seem commendable. Fair compensation for labor is something that millions of workers and unions fight for around the world in various industries and sectors. So why wouldn't this apply to UFC as well, right? It makes sense. If two fighters are willing to enter a steel cage, pulverize each other, and possible grievous bodily harm to entertain millions of people around the world, and in turn make Dana White and his cronies ultra-rich, they ought to be compensated fairly for literally leaving their blood, sweat, and tears inside the octagon. Paul took the combat sports world by storm since becoming a professional boxer in 2020, and since then, he has pestered White and essentially mocked him for the way he compensates his athletes. And honestly, kudos to Paul for taking White to task on the issue. Next up, what does this war of words look like up close? You're about to find out. We're about to see what Paul's word is worth, because he has promised to continue making fun of White until the UFC tycoon makes real change in terms of how he compensates the future fighters of his organization. With record amounts of pay-per-view cash flowing into the UFC, the fighters ought to get a better share of the pie. After all, for White, the UFC has pretty much been a license to print money year after year, so shortchanging his fighter seems wrong on a number of levels. Jake Paul's fight promotions company, Most Valuable Promotions, posted a cartoon recently that showed Paul getting under White's skin by trolling the UFC big shot with messages that are, well, accurate. Along with the cartoon, Paul included a caption indicating his plans and intentions. In the cartoon, Paul says, "I'm going to relentlessly dunk on you with factual examples of your and your company's behavior, verifiable by court documents." White then replied, "Oh yeah? Well, you're stupid and on steroids, and your manager, he's a warlock. You're not a star. Not like Masvidal, Diaz, and McGregor. Guys who sit out and have financial grievances with me are the real stars." At the same time, in a thought bubble, White says, "Damn it, I'm never supposed to admit the fighters have value." Can we just be honest here and admit that Paul's cartoon is hilarious? Moreover, Paul's entire attack on White is as warranted as it is funny. The cartoon has been liked thousands of times and reads, "Facts always win." Up next, what is the goal of Paul's Most Valuable Promotions company? Let's find out. To best understand, all you have to do is read the rest of the caption in Paul's cartoon post. MVP is not here to start its own competing MMA league. In fact, Jake and MVP admire what UFC has built over the past 28 years. The sport has matured into a successful public global media company with fixed recurring revenues. Now is the time to evolve the company to benefit fighters equitably, which will help grow the sport even more. Jake wants to use his platform to help make that happen. Hopefully others join him on this journey. Happy New Year and welcome to 2022. Paul is willing to move into the world of MMA, enter the USADA drug testing pool, but only if White will implement a number of changes to the structure of the UFC that are guaranteed to benefit fighters in the future. Among Paul's list of demands is an increase in the minimum fighter payment from $12,000 to $50,000, a guaranteed revenue split of 50% between the fighters and the company, and Paul is demanding long-term health care for all fighters. White scoffed at Paul's claims and told him he should get tested for steroids. This came in response to Paul accusing White of hitting the slopes, and we're not talking about skiing, we're talking about cocaine, which according to Paul and some other sources, White loves to enjoy. In an angry reply on Instagram, White said to Paul, "You can't sell pay-per-views. You're calling out Jorge Masvidal because he's a pay-per-view superstar. Nate Diaz, Conor McGregor, Mike Tyson, these are all superstars. You're not. You can't sell pay-per-views. So you do whatever the hell you want to do. I'm ready to roll, buddy. Let's do this, Jake." Man, this beef is leveling up to DEFCON 4. Stay tuned and don't go away, because we've got some of the latest action-packed UFC news on the way. You won't want to miss it. Next up, if Dustin Poirier and Nate Diaz step into the octagon, who would your money be on? Let's dig a little deeper. If Dustin Poirier and Nate Diaz step into the octagon, it is going to be a slugfest and possibly a bloodbath. It would be the country boy versus the West Coast bad boy, and if there's one thing we know about both of these guys, it's that they can bang. Now, the UFC wants Nate Diaz to sign a contract extension to fight Dustin Poirier. The UFC would be happy to let Nate Diaz and Dustin Poirier fight, so long as Nate agrees to add one more bout onto his expiring contract with the UFC. Poirier and Diaz have been chirping at each other for several months now about a potential big money fight in early 2022. However, we are sorry to report that nothing has been inked yet. According to MMA host Ariel Helwani, the issue is Nate Diaz's contract running out of fights and the UFC's efforts in trying to stop him from becoming a free agent until he fights McGregor for round 3. Helwani spoke about a potential Diaz versus Poirier matchup and had this to say: Nate obviously wants the fight. Nathan wants to fight. Dustin wants the fight. The UFC actually wants the fight, but they want it with a caveat. They want to extend Diaz's contract, and that's going to be the push and pull in this whole scenario, right? It's, all right, you want this fight? Sign for more fights, right? All right, you want this fight? Well, we need you for one more. And the option that was thrown out was, all right, you want this fight? You have to add one more, and that would be the Conor fight, which is not a bad deal. But then they have to make sure that the numbers line up. Up next, how will negotiating a Diaz fight with McGregor make the Poirier-Diaz fight happen? Let's take a look. For the UFC to negotiate a Diaz versus Poirier fight, it must first negotiate a price with Diaz for a third fight with Conor McGregor. At the same time, Dana White and the UFC are trying to make it abundantly clear to everyone on the UFC's roster, no matter how hot they are, that they shouldn't expect what White referred to as Deontay Wilder money, even if they're selling the same amount of pay-per-views as Floyd Mayweather. Side note, does anyone still think Jake Paul doesn't have a point about Dana White? Let's look at the first two McGregor versus Diaz fights. They generated 1.3 and 1.6 million pay-per-views, and while UFC 244 numbers were never made public, it's clear that the event sold a ton of units as well. Considering the mountain of money Nate Diaz has made for the UFC, it's always maddening to see how unwilling the UFC seems to be to pay Diaz what he deserves. There's no question that Nate would be willing to accept a third fight with McGregor if the price was right, because let's be honest here, if Diaz steps into the octagon with the Angry Irishman, Diaz is probably going to knock him out. But because of the lack of a deal between Diaz, White, and the UFC to make the McGregor fight happen, it basically tells us where things sit. Finally, what's the UFC's biggest problem? Jake Paul, the current thorn in the UFC side, has said repeatedly that he's willing to shower Diaz with bags full of cash. Helwani said, what's going on now is a fascinating thing. Jake Paul is in this thing in the end. And Masvidal and Diaz and all these guys are looking at him and being like, we can make a ton of money if we just go over to this world. We just have to get out of this UFC contract. The biggest problem with the UFC today is money and politics. Those two things are literally standing in the way of awesome fights. It's clear that White doesn't care about entertaining fans or paying his fighters what they're owed. For White, it's all about one thing and one thing only: the Benjamins. And that's a wrap for today's video, fight fans. Thanks for watching. Hit us with a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any of the awesome videos we've got coming your way.